Hi, in this video, I'd like to show you how to create multi-step gradients using p5.js and a little bit of Canvas code. As you can see, I'm running this sketch in my browser, and as I refresh the page, you get randomly generated colored gradients. I'm running this p5.js sketch in instance mode as an ES module, and I also installed one of the color package that I found on npm called Fette Palette. So we'll look at that as well. So we'll need to use some of the terminal commands for installing npm package. And you can use any code editor you like, something like VS Code. Although I'll be using NeoVim inside the terminal, but that doesn't matter. Anyways, let's dive in. Here I'm inside my terminal. I created this empty folder p5 gradient vid on my desktop. So you can also create your own folder somewhere. And when I list it, there's nothing in it. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be using p5 in instance mode. And if you've never used instance mode before, it's a little different, but not that much. And you don't have to worry too much about it because I'll be using a template code and all the setup is done already. So I'm going to clone this repo, gh repo clone /p5-template-esm. And you'll need to have this gh command installed in your terminal using something like Homebrew. You can also use git clone command as well. And because I'm already in the folder that I want to use, I'm going to specify that I want to clone this repo into the current directory by using dot. And when I hit enter, it's cloned. Then you can see I have readme, index.html, package.json, and source folder as well. So now you can open this folder in your favorite code editor. I'll be using NeoVim in the terminal. Inside the source folder, you can find index.js file, which you can open. And this is sort of a boilerplate code. It's running in instance mode, meaning you'll have to prepend any p5.js functions and variables with p. So p object here internally has all the functions and variables. So instead of just saying setup, you say p.setup, and instead of create canvas, it's p.create canvas. Same thing with variables. Instead of window width, it's p.window width. Just don't forget to use p object. And in terms of running, this sketch is set up with vid.js builder and bundler package. So you can open up another terminal window. And first, we'll need to install all the dependencies. So npm -i will install packages, and then you run it npm run dev. So this will run a local server. In my case, it's now at localhost :5173, but that port number may be different on your computer. So when you open that localhost page, you will see gray background with white circle. And I'll be overlaying my terminal window, code editor window, and the browser behind, just so we can see both at the same time, and I'll be switching between them sometimes. We'll do it step by step, and the first step is to just create a simple radial gradient. But unfortunately, p5.js doesn't support canvas gradient. So we're going to have to use canvas context directly. And p5 does provide drawing context, which is just raw canvas context object. And you can console log it just to see. And when you open up the console window, it's just a generic canvas rendering context 2D object. But this name is too long, so I want to store it in another object called ctx. And we haven't created ctx object yet, so let's do it inside this sketch function called letCTX. And let's go to the draw function, and right before ellipse, I will create a gradient object by calling ctx.create radial gradient. As you can see from the reference, this method takes 6 parameters. So first 3 is for the coordinate of the center xy and the radius of it. And the next 3 is for the outer circle. x1, y1 of the outer circle and the radius as well. So in this case, I want to start from the very center and then keep the same position, but the gradient will just radiate outwards. So I'm going to use p.width over 2 and p.height over 2. Same position as this ellipse. And the radius of the first one can be very small. I'll just say 0.1. And the outer circle will still be at the center, but the radius will be a lot bigger. I'm just going to use 200 for now. So that's our gradient object. And we haven't specified the colors we want to use. So we can do that with add color stop method. So grad.add color stop. And you first define offset. So the way the gradient, canvas gradient works is you specify a number called offset between 0 and 1. So 0 is the offset at the end of the gradient. 1 is the offset at the other end of the gradient. So the first one, 0, I will use blue. And for the other end, which is offset of 1, I'm going to use yellow. When I save it, nothing happens because we haven't assigned this gradient to our ellipse yet. So in P5, you know how to set fill color, p.fill and some number like this, right? So it is now set to red. But now we have gradient object. So if I try to just set it with grad object, it's gonna throw you an error. That argument was not a valid color representation because p5.js doesn't support canvas gradient object. So instead of using p5.js fill function, I will use ctx.fillStyle. This is what the raw canvas API provides. ctx.fillStyle. So I'm just going to assign this gradient. And now you can see we have this radial gradient assigned to this ellipse. But it doesn't even look like yellow here, right? It looks like blue to almost gray. That's because when we are creating gradient, we specified radius, but when we are creating ellipse with p5.js function, this is a diameter or width and height. So there's a mismatch here. So I'm gonna have to have this value, and then you can see it's going from blue to yellow. And you can also include many other colors in between, as long as that offset value is between 0 and 1. So if I want to create another color right in the middle, I can do that by saying 0.5 and say red this time. So now it's going from blue to red to yellow. So that's the basics of using radial gradient with P5 shape. But here's the thing. Now, if I want to create some other object, let's say I want to draw a rect and just put some random position. And then I want to set the color to white, but it's yellow. It looks like the gradient we set is still affecting the shapes you are drawing after. I think it's because internally there is something mixed up between Canvas code and P5 code. But there is a way we can solve this problem. When you are using ctx.fillStyle or StrokeStyle, using just Canvas code, we can surround it with p.push and p.pop. When you do that, any code surrounded by push and pop block will be isolated and it's not going to affect the code outside of it. So when I now save it, it is back to normal, just white rectangle. So that's something you just have to remember when you're using Canvas code and P5 code in the same sketch. So I just wanted to show you that. So let me delete the rect. And here's one more thing I want to do. First, I want to remove the stroke. So let's say p.noStroke. And also I want this edge to be smoother instead of having this yellow hard edge. And to do that, we'll use alpha channel. So instead of just using named color like yellow, we can input different color mode. This time I will use RGBA. And if I want the same yellow, it'll be 255, 255, and 0. And alpha channel will be 0. And let me also delete the middle part, the red. So it'll just go from blue to yellow. And as it goes from blue to yellow, alpha channel is going from 1 to 0. So it'll create this very soft edge around it. So that's how I like it. And what's also interesting is this radial gradient is not just limited to ellipse. You can have radial gradients within rect. So let me show you. If I just draw a rect, now radial gradient is filling this rect. The position has changed because ellipse is drawn from the center, whereas rect is drawn from top left corner. So I can just change the rect mode to be p.center. And the effect will be more obvious if I just change the alpha channel back to 1, like this. So you can have radial gradient within rect or other shapes. And what gets more interesting is that radial gradient position and the shape position doesn't have to be the same. So if I update my radial gradient position to x to be width over 2 plus 40, just some random number, then it still works. Same thing with y value. Let's say minus 20. Maybe here it's minus 10. So that works fine as well. And if I change the smaller radius to be 20 and the bigger one to be 200, that works too. So I think it opens up a lot of possibility for us to play with it and create something more expressive. So now I'm going to combine what we've learned so far and fill the entire browser window with a few radial gradients. So I'm going to set my rect. Let me delete rect mode. And instead of setting the position to be at the center, I'm going to start drawing from 0, 0, all the way at the top left corner, and all the way down to width and height. And also, let's just change alpha back to 0. And we can make this radius to be somewhat bigger. How about maximum of width of 3? And this smaller radius to be something very small. And let me also change x position to be width over 3, just for now. And I can just copy this entire gradient and entire rect drawing and create another gradient. Let me fix it quickly to gradient 2, same here and same here. And change its color. How about pink? And some random value like this, and change its position as well. So this is the basics. All we have left to do is figuring out how to generate some interesting color palette and also how to create multiple gradients, tens of gradient objects in a more sensible way, more manageable way. I will create an array called grad data. So here I will store any data that are associated with gradients. So this will be an array, and it'll be an array of objects. And each object will be in this format. So when we create a gradient, we need to know x and y position and radius. So two groups of x and y and radius, and also at least 2 color stops. So these are the things that I want to store in my object. And there will be many gradient objects. So I need position 1, radius 1, and color 1, and position 2, radius 2, and color 2. And each position will have x and y values. And that'll be stored in an array called grad data. And I also need to set number of gradients that I want to use, how many gradient objects that I want to use. Let's start with 20. I mean, you can always come back and change this, right? And now it's time to fill in this grad data array. So I'm going to go to setup. I will create a for loop. So I until number of gradients. And for each position, radius, and color, we'll just try to randomize. So const position 1 will be an array which will hold x and y values. So math.random times p.width, and y will be same. Math.random times p.height. And for r1, radius 1, it can be something small. So I can just do maybe random times 5 plus 1. So at least it'll be 1 pixel plus random between 0 and 5. And color will be, for now, I will just set it to the same color, just black. But later we will install another library so we can generate a color palette, something more nicer. So that's for the first group, position 1, R1, and C1. Now it's time to set position 2, R2, and C2. And for now, I mean, later you can always customize it. But for now, position 2 will be the same as position 1 because right here, when we create this first radial gradient, we use the same value for each x and y pair. And R2 will be much bigger, right? Because it'll be the outer side. So I can do math.random 50. So it'll have a difference of 50, but at least it'll be as big as p.width over 3. And in terms of color C2, for now, let's just use blue. So all the data we need to create gradient is ready. So it's time to just push to grad data array in this order. Position 1, R1, C1, position 2, R2, and C2. I mean, the order doesn't really matter, right? Because this is an object and we can always access each property with their names. So let's just console log to make sure everything looks okay. So when I go to the browser and open up the console log, we can see there are 20 different objects, all having the same format. C1, C2, black and blue, randomized position 1 and 2, and they are all the same, 1 and 2, and R1 and R2 are different. R1 is much smaller and R2 is a lot bigger. So it looks correct to me. Then now let's go to draw, and instead of manually creating each gradient object, we can iterate over grad data array using for each loop. And for each grad, we can create new gradient, radial gradient object, and then use it to draw each rect. So it'll almost be the same. So let me just bring this block into my for each loop and then replace these lines. So that'll be position 1 as 0 index. 0 will be x and index of 1 will be y. And instead of 1, I can say R1. Oh, I made a mistake. So it's not just position 1, but it'll be grad dot position 1, right? So we're going to have to prepend with grad. My mistake. So here it'll be grad position 2, 0, and grad position 2 and index of 1, and lastly grad dot R2. And same thing with add color stop. At 0 index, we'll use grad.c1, and color stop at offset of 1, it'll be color 2, C2. Now if I save it, nothing happens. Let's check why. Let me open up my console. There's an error. Identifier grad has already been declared. Maybe I have declared grad object twice. Let me see. I made another mistake because I'm iterating over grad data using for each loop, using the name grad for each object, but the radial gradient object created using that data is also called grad. So that's an error. So one of them has to be changed. And I will change this one. Instead of calling grad, I'm just going to call it G. And then add color style is on the grad object, not G. And field style as well. That'll be grad. And now it's fixed. There's no error. And I'm going to delete this grad2, which we used to test. So let's just delete that. And now we only see a single radial gradient. What's going on? I believe when we were creating num gradient in setup, we used C1 to be black and C2 to be blue, but we had no way to specify the alpha value, right? Because the second color needs to be alpha of 0 so it can blend with each other. So I'm going to have to change to RGBA again, and the blue value will be 00255 and the alpha of 0. And let's save it again, and then now we start to see each gradient sort of blending into each other. There are some empty spots that we can see that gray background too. But as far as the gradients go, it's working fine. And if I increase the number of gradients, all we need to do is just change the value of num gradients variable. Something like this. Okay, now one last thing left to do is to install the Fette Palette library and use it to generate a color palette. So let's open up another terminal window. Make sure you are in the same folder as our sketch so that we can install that package in the same project. And I'm going to use the command called npm I for install Fette Palette. The installing is done. We can close this terminal window and come back to our code editor. And at the top, we will import a function called generate random color ramp from Fette Palette. And above setup function, we're going to create a const palette and use this function, generate random color ramp. And it takes a bunch of properties inside this object. There's like total number of colors, center hue value, hue cycle, tint, shade, accent. So you can customize a lot. And I found a group of values that I found working nicely. So total number of colors will be the same as number of gradients. And the center hue will be randomized between 0 and 360, meaning the full color range from, color circle. And hue cycle will be at least 0.2 and some randomized. So sometimes it'll have similar hues, sometimes very different hues. And offset tint, offset shade, minimum saturate and lightness value, and color mode of hsla. I think this part is important, color mode, which color mode that we use. Because when we generate palette and just console log it, then we get this object back, which has all base, dark, and light. So you can use one of them depending on which type of color palette you like to use. So I'm going to use base. So when we look inside base, it's just a bunch of number array, but they are formatted in hsla format. So hue goes from 0 to 360, and saturation and lightness goes from 0 to 1 and 0 to 1. So that's something we'll have to remember. So again, I'm going to use base. So instead of using the entire palette, after it's generated, I'm just going to get base. So let's check the console log again. Then we just get 30 different colors created with this set of rules. So we'll have to format our colors using hsla color model. And because we'll have to do that a few times, I'm going to create a function that will take three numbers, hue from 0 to 360, and saturation and lightness from 0 to 1, and turn that into hsla color string. So here's a function to do just that. It takes two parameters, color and alpha. And if you don't specify alpha value, it'll just default to 1. And it will return hsla color string. Hue goes from 0 to 360, that's the same. But the saturation and lightness will be the 0 to 100%. So we'll have to multiply by 100 and add the percent sign as part of the string. And the alpha goes from 0 to 1. So let's use two hsla string function that we just added to convert the color that's returned from Fette Palette generate random color ramp function. So I'm going to go over to the setup function where we set C1 and C2. Here, I will just pick a random color from the palette. So math.random times palette.length, but that has to be floored because it'll be a float value. So math.floor. And we know that this value itself is just an array of 3 numbers, h, s, and l. So we'll use toHSL string function that we just added to convert that to CSS color string, hsla, in that format. And in terms of C2, it'll be pretty much the same as C1. And then we get some gradients, but it looks like there's only one. That's because the second color in our gradient, it needs to have an alpha value of 0 so it can blend with other gradients below it. And we know that our toHSL string function can take an optional parameter called a, which defaults to 1, but we can set it to 0. So if I go to the end of C2 color and add another parameter called 0, and then now we start to see gradients. So that's 30 different gradients. We can increase it, decrease it, do what you like to do. And if you want to try a different color palette, you can maybe use dark instead of base. Then we get the combination of dark colors. And of course, you can customize these values. If you feel like center hue doesn't have to go all the way around the color circle, then you can just use other values. I don't know, like 200 or something like that. So there's a lot you can customize, and I'm not even using all the properties that this function provides. So make sure to check out the documentation page of Fette Palette library. So there you have it. Multicolor gradients using P5 and Canvas code.